Hi, I'm Patrick Page. I am performing All the Devils Are Here, How Shakespeare Invented the Villain at BroadStage, January 15th through 25th. Oh my goodness. Well, you know, they say the devil gets the best songs, which is mostly true. I think the thing about villains for me is, well, first of all, they're a lot of fun, aren't they? The villain knows exactly what he wants. The hero doesn't frequently. The hero, like Hamlet, is saying, what the hell do I want? I'm trying to find out what I want. The villain knows precisely what he wants. He goes for it, and very frequently he has fun doing so. So a character like the Green Goblin, for example, is just a ball to play. Now, with Shakespeare's villains, they're human beings. That's what my show is about how he took a theatrical convention, which was a medieval convention called the Vice, who was pure evil and just enjoyed his wickedness. And Shakespeare took that character and added more and more and more human characteristics, so that by the time he gets to the end of his career, 20 years later, the villains are fully human. And that's why we today expect those qualities in the villains or even in the characters that we see. You know, if you go to see a Marvel movie, you expect that villain to have a motivation, a backstory. You expect him to be three-dimensional. That comes from Shakespeare. My favorite fictional villain from childhood was Dracula, if you can call Dracula a villain. I watched Dark Shadows every day at 4 o'clock when I was a kid, and I was obsessed with Barnabas Collins. Maybe I should say Barnabas Collins was my favorite. And then that led to Dracula, and that led to where we are today. I think the thing about a well-crafted antagonist, I've touched on it a little bit. He's not doubtful about what he wants. He knows precisely what he wants. And sometimes that's very complicated. Sometimes very complicated what he wants. For example, Claudius in Hamlet is an extremely complicated villain. If one were to say simply, he wants to get away with the crime, you'd miss the boat. The thing that Shakespeare did in Hamlet was to give Claudius a conscience. So what Claudius wants is to be free of his guilt and be able to enjoy his life, his new marriage, his new crown. And he finds himself unable to do so. The first reminder of that, of course, is Hamlet, who's around skulking about his father. And then, of course, as Claudius suspects that Hamlet may know something about the murder, that's another problem. You see, that's the thing about murder or evil. You think it's just once, and it never is. The next thing is the cover-up. The cover-up involves more crime. So that's the circle you get into. Well, it's so interesting, you know, humor. Humor is part of the tradition of the villain from the very beginning. The villains we have today in Western culture all come from this character in medieval morality plays called the medieval vice. And the vice embodied certain characteristics. He could be the vice covetous, he could be the vice pride, he could be the vice gluttony, but he had one attribute that came from the 7 deadly sins. And then he would try to corrupt the everyman character and try to get that character to be covetous or lustful or prideful and so on. That character in those plays, which those plays ran from the early 1400s up until Shakespeare was writing in 1590, that character was hilarious. You see, morality plays are boring. They're really boring. They're just like dramatized sermons, literally, in which the other actors would play virtues. Somebody would play, forgiveness, let's say, although that wasn't one of them. It's just not coming to my mind now. But they would embody these different virtues. And the vice would come in and mess it all up, right? So the virtues are boring. They're preachy. Now, this convention, the morality plays, lasted for 150 years. It was the most popular form of entertainment, other than public executions, for 150 years. How did they do that? They did that by making the vice funny. And the vice was the show, and very frequently played by a professional comedian. So when Shakespeare takes that convention and uses it to create the character of Richard III, Richard III is funny. When he uses it to create the character of Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, Aaron the Moor is funny. So all the way up to our modern times, a character like Hannibal Lecter, his wit, his sense of humor, his enjoyment of what he's doing, that goes back to the medieval vice. The only thing is, all those other characters from the morality plays are gone. They don't exist anymore. They're extinct. That's why I couldn't remember their names. But there were a lot of them. The vice survived. And the vice survived because Shakespeare adapted him and made him human. And that's where we get Hannibal Lecter. First of all, I'm not exactly what keeps the show running. And Natalie, my stage manager, really keeps the show running. She does all the work that makes it look like I'm doing a one-man show. And also there's a crew backstage. Here at Broad, I'm meeting them. Johnny Angel's my dresser and runs all the wardrobe. And Joy is backstage and hands me things that I need. So there are a lot of people making it look like I'm doing a one-man show. But the challenge of acting on stage by oneself is a unique thing. And I find that Shakespeare is very well suited for that, because most of these characters have soliloquies, and a Shakespearean soliloquy is written to be delivered to the audience. The audience is the partner. It's not the character, in most instances, working something through to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows. That's not how it was written to be performed. You can play with that and it's fun. How it was written to be performed is to the audience. What do you think? To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. And he shares the problem with the audience and tries to find a solution with them. I also get to do scenes in the show that have more than one character. So the section from The Merchant of Venice is a scene between Antonio the merchant and Shylock the moneylender. And that's wonderful to play both parts. The scene in Othello is between Iago and Othello. The scene in Macbeth is between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So that allows me to shift shapes and become different characters. I hope audiences come away with a few things. One, if they walked into the theater with any fears or apprehensions about Shakespeare, I hope they walk out of it free of those fears and apprehensions. If they walked into the theater thinking that Shakespeare was dull or difficult or not for them, I hope they would walk out disabused of those ideas. Now, here's what I'll say. Shakespeare is difficult. It's difficult in the way that a Mozart sonata is difficult. In other words, it's absolutely sublime if it's played by someone who is trained and expert in the playing of it. But if you gave a Mozart sonata to someone who was only, just tangentially acquainted with the music, it would be monstrous. The same with Shakespeare. And so what I've done is spend most of my life trying to get better at communicating these ideas through this language to the audience, because they're enormously complex. We use metaphor and simile in everyday life in a fairly simple way. We may grab for a metaphor. I may say, when my mother was in hospice, I went in and she looked like a naked baby bird. And through that image, which you just saw in your mind, I was able to communicate more about my mother's condition than I would have been able to without that image. Shakespeare, it wouldn't be so. Shakespeare could paint an entire thing, an image that's so detailed and so complex that I give you way, way more of a feeling about my mother's condition. The actor, of course, has to be very skilled at communicating those images. It's also music. So Shakespeare communicates through sound, through rhythm. It's musical. And music communicates on a different level than language does. Shakespeare combines those. So there's the meaning of the language, and then there's the music of the language, and the cadence and the rhythm, all of them communicating at once. And so you get a much more detailed picture of reality than language can offer on its own. But Shakespeare does not use language decoratively. That's a huge misunderstanding about Shakespeare. So if he uses an image, it's because the image specifies what he's talking about, not decorates it. When Juliet reaches for an image, let's say, my bounty, Romeo says, I don't want to, I don't want to use this up. I don't want to use up the love. And she says, my bounty is as boundless as the sea, my love as deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite. She's expressed something about the nature of love in her language, true love, that's sublime and true, not decorative. She didn't say it that way in order to be beautiful. It is beautiful because it is true.